Today we're talking about the settings that I use to get the most filmic or cinematic look from the Sigma FP. But first, if you're new to the channel, my name is Anson, and on this channel we talk about filmmaking, specifically filmmaking gear, tutorials, and a look at the projects that I'm working on. And so if that's something you're into, consider subscribing. Recently, I picked up a second Sigma FP, and with setting up that camera, I was going through a lot of my settings, and I felt like it would be a good time to make a settings video so that you all can see what settings I'm using with the Sigma FP, more specifically when I'm doing narrative type projects or what I'm primarily doing right now, which is behind the scenes filmmaking or potentially documentary filmmaking. And so these are the settings I'm using to get the most organic or filmic or even cinematic look from the Sigma FP on those projects. Starting first, we'll go ahead and dive in talking about the resolution, the codec, and the frame rates I'm primarily using with the Sigma FP on these projects. Now, primarily with the Sigma FP, especially if I don't need slow motion, I'm going to be shooting in 4K, which is the UHD option. Now, if I'm shooting on the Blackmagic Video Assist, I will use 4K DCI, and I'll put somewhere on the screen how you access the menu on how to determine what resolution you want to shoot on the Blackmagic Video Assist. Now, if I do need to use slow motion, I will go down to 1080p, but everything else does stay in 4K. Now, as far as codecs, I'm either shooting in BRAW on the Blackmagic Video Assist, primarily the 12:1 compression, or if I'm shooting just with the Sigma FP, or even sometimes if I'm just using the Video Assist as a field monitor, I will shoot in the full Cinema DNG 12-bit RAW. Lately, I have been toying with the 8-bit Cinema DNG codec, and I've actually been pretty impressed with it, so let me know in the comments below if you'd like a comparison between the 8-bit and the 12-bit. I may make that video, but that's really only if I have just my V90 card and I don't want to take the SSD out with me. That is what the Sigma FP is limited to when you are shooting to an SD card when it comes to 4K. Now, talking about frame rates, if I'm shooting 4K, I'm primarily shooting 24 frames per second. That is the film industry standard for natural motion blur. That's what the standard has been for quite some time. We are seeing more films being filmed in 60 frames per second or even higher, but that is what I'm primarily using when I'm doing more narrative, behind the scenes, or documentary work. Now, if I'm using slow motion, I'll fluctuate between 60 frames per second and 48 frames per second. So that's the first category of frame rate, resolution, as well as codecs that I'm using with the Sigma FP. Let's go ahead to the next category, which is exposure as well as white balance. Now, while we're in this category, I will mention that you may notice that a lot of the things that I'm using are on my quick select menu. And so if you do want to access that menu, go to your system menu to the second page, and that's where you can edit your quick select menu. And I'll leave it up on the screen what I'm using. I'm primarily using a lot of my exposure options, resolution options, and frame rate options on that quick select menu. I'll be honest, I'm probably living in this quick select menu when I'm changing any settings. Now, you can see on the menu, I do have ISO. As far as ISO, I do keep the Sigma FP in one of its two native ISO levels, and that is either 100 or 3200 ISO. To help with exposure beyond that point, I'm using NDs to cut down light, and if I can't do what I need to do with ND filters, my last resort is to possibly change the aperture. But I will do everything that I can to keep the Sigma FP in one of its two native ISOs to help with its overall dynamic range. Now, going along with the exposure, you have shutter speed or shutter angle. I love the Sigma FP for the fact that it does offer shutter angle. Without going into great detail, shutter angle is amazing because I can put the shutter angle at 180 degrees, go between any frame rate that I would like without having to adjust it to get a natural motion blur. Now, continuing the conversation with exposure, with the newest firmware for the Sigma FP, you have the ability to use false color. And so with that, I do have the false color mapped to my wheel on the back of the camera. I think it's left. If I press left, it will activate false color. I do have to hold it to see the false color, and then once I let it go, it will turn it off. Something you may also want to do with this is on the 5th page of the shooting menu, you can actually see the color values for false color. So if you're not sure what the color values are, that will actually tell you as far as exposure, what's underexposed, what's overexposed, and so you have really good information on that page to see what those color values with false color actually are. Now, talking about exposure as well as function buttons, when it comes to aperture, I do have the aperture mapped to my front wheel, and so those are some exposure options that I'm using with the FP and the settings that I'm using. Let's talk about white balance, because honestly, yes, you're shooting in RAW, and so really this is kind of like a loose thing to pay attention to because you can always fix that in post. But but I still try to get the right white balance in the camera so it's doing less in post. But that being said, if I'm doing a day shoot, I'm probably just using the cloudy white balance setting. I'm not really moving beyond that because it'll get me close enough to where I need to be, and then I'll fix the rest in post. Now, if the set that I'm working on does use more tungsten lighting, I will change the white balance to a more tungsten friendly white balance. But that being said, I would still try to not use auto white balance, even though you can fix those things in post, because it may be adjusting in the middle of your shot. It just may make more work for you in post-production. So the last thing I want to talk about is my display settings, basically what tools I put on the display. The first thing I want to mention is focus assist tools. Now, sometimes I will use focus peaking, but more often than not with the Sigma FP, I am going to use the focus magnification tool, and more specifically, I'm going to make sure it's the full screen option that you have so that the full rear display of the Sigma FP magnifies on your subject so you can nail focus. This is actually what I'm using a lot of times over focus peaking, just because it's a little bit easier for me to punch in on my subject, make sure everything is tack sharp, and punch right back out. And what's really cool too is while you're in that full screen focus magnification, you can actually half press the shutter and it will go back to the original picture so you can see the overall composition. Now, something to go along with that, I do make sure to keep my touch operation turned on, and you can change that in the system settings screen as well. And that will basically allow me to tap on the rear display anywhere I want the focus magnification tool to focus in on, and that just really helps with a very fast workflow. A couple other things I use help with composition, which is I do use a grid that helps with my rule of thirds. That just helps make sure I get everything where it needs to be composition wise, and I also do have my level turned on just to make sure my horizon is leveled. Now, going along the lines of composition, I do use the hell out of frame guides. I use 2 custom frame guides with the Sigma FP. I have a 2:1 ratio, and I also have a 5:9. The 5:9 is supposed to give me around the same frame guide as a 9:16 ratio, but with the FP, you can't put double digits on the second half of the ratio, so I had to kind of play around to find what ratio worked relatively the same as 9:16, and I found that 5:9 worked really well. So that's what I'm using if I'm having to deliver anything in vertical format. But with the 2:1 ratio, that's actually what I'm using for pretty much everything else. This video is actually in a 2:1 ratio, and that is to take full advantage of mobile devices. Now, it's not a full scope ratio because that tends to be overkill with mobile devices, but this gives you a lot of screen real estate on mobile devices when those devices are in landscape mode. Now, if you guys are interested in how to do that in post-production, I may make a video on that. If you are interested, let me know in the comments below. And so with that said, those are my settings for the Sigma FP. That's what I'm using, I would say 99.9% of the time. I rarely change the FP to do anything else than what I've described in this video. Now, before I go, I do want to mention that with the Sigma FP, there's a really cool option that offers you to have a QR code populated to take your custom settings to another FP, which is really helpful when I was setting up my new FP. And so for you, my viewers, what I'm going to offer is my specific QR code to my custom settings that I've talked about here today. And so I'm actually going to leave a QR code right here. And so if you want to scan that QR code, just pause the video, scan the QR code, and that will get you set up with some of these settings. And so that's it for me. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope this was helpful to see my settings that I use for the Sigma FP for narrative, behind the scenes, or documentary projects. If you do have questions, let me know in the comments below. And as always, thank you for joining. Go and find your journey. Go embrace life. Peace.